You reach for the salt shaker without thinking, a pinch on your eggs, a dash in your pasta water. It's so ordinary you barely register it as a substance at all. But for most of human history, this small white crystal wasn't ordinary. It was one of the most valuable things a person could own. So how did humans first figure out they needed it? And how did a simple rock end up shaping wars, trade routes, and entire civilizations? Let's start with the body itself, because the story of salt doesn't begin with discovery. It begins with a craving your ancestors couldn't ignore. Your body cannot function without sodium. It regulates fluid balance, transmits nerve signals, and keeps your muscles, including your heart, contracting correctly. Without it, cells stop communicating properly and eventually the body shuts down. This isn't a preference, it's biology. And here's the problem your earliest ancestors faced. The human body cannot produce sodium on its own. Every bit of it has to come from outside. For hunter-gatherers eating mostly meat, this wasn't much of an issue. Animal blood and tissue naturally contain sodium, enough to meet basic needs without seeking it out separately. But as human diets began shifting, particularly once agriculture spread and grains and vegetables made up more of the daily intake, that natural sodium source largely disappeared. Plant foods are notoriously low in sodium. Suddenly, populations that used to get what they needed from meat were coming up short. Physiologist Alan Epstein, working at the University of Pennsylvania in the 20th century, spent decades studying something he called salt appetite, an innate, deeply wired drive distinct from ordinary hunger or thirst. Epstein's research on animals showed that when sodium levels drop in the body, a specific neural and hormonal signal fires, driving the organism to actively seek out salty substances, sometimes with startling intensity, even in animals that had never encountered concentrated salt before. This wasn't learned behavior, it was built in. Which means humans didn't have to be taught that salt tasted good. Their bodies were already engineered to crave it the moment they needed it. So when early humans stumbled onto salt deposits, dried lake beds, mineral licks, or evaporated seawater pools, their bodies didn't need convincing. Now here's where things get archaeological, and this is where we have real physical evidence instead of just biological theory. In 2012, Bulgarian archaeologist Vasil Nikolov led excavations at a site called Provadia-Solnitsata, meaning literally salt pit in Bulgarian. What his team uncovered turned out to be the oldest known prehistoric salt production town in Europe, dating back to roughly 4,700 BCE. Long before the wheel, long before writing, people at this site were already boiling brine from a natural spring in clay vessels, extracting solid salt, and fortifying the entire settlement with substantial stone walls, thick enough to suggest the salt itself was worth defending. Nikolov's excavation found evidence of specialized ovens built specifically for salt processing, along with massive amounts of broken pottery used to hold and boil the brine solution. This wasn't a casual side activity. It was organized, large-scale production, run by people who understood exactly what they were making and exactly how valuable it was. That single detail, the defensive walls, tells you almost everything about how quickly salt shifted from biological necessity to economic commodity. Once humans figured out how to reliably extract salt rather than simply stumbling onto natural deposits, everything changed. Suddenly, this substance that regulated every cell in the human body could also be stored, transported, and traded. And unlike most foods available to early societies, dried salt didn't spoil, it didn't rot. It could sit in a warehouse or travel across a continent and still be exactly as valuable months later as the day it was extracted. This single property, the fact that salt never decays, is arguably the real reason it became one of the first true forms of currency in human history. Historian Mark Kurlansky, who spent years researching the global history of salt trade, documented how thoroughly this one mineral shaped ancient economies. Roman soldiers, according to historical trade records Kurlansky examined, were sometimes paid partially in salt, a practice widely believed to be the origin of the word salary, derived from the Latin word for salt itself. Whether or not every soldier's full wage came this way, the linguistic fossil survived for a reason. Salt was valuable enough, stable enough, and universally needed enough to function as money long before coins were standardized. And salt didn't just create currency, it created roads. Ancient trade routes across the Sahara Desert moved massive slabs of salt from mines in the north down to West African kingdoms, where salt was so scarce it was sometimes traded pound for pound against gold. Caravans of hundreds of camels made this crossing, often taking weeks, moving through some of the harshest terrain on the planet, purely because the substance on one end of the trip was nearly worthless there and nearly priceless everywhere else. Historical accounts of the medieval Mali Empire describe the city of Timbuktu functioning as a critical hub in this trade, where merchants exchanged slabs of salt cut directly from desert mines for gold dust carried up from mining regions further south. In China, archaeological evidence from Sichuan province shows salt wells being drilled using bamboo cable percussion techniques as early as the 1st century BCE, some reaching depths of several hundred feet, an engineering feat that predates modern drilling technology by nearly 2,000 years. These weren't primitive scrape and collect operations. They were sophisticated industrial systems built specifically because the demand for salt justified extraordinary engineering effort. So the discovery of salt wasn't really one moment, it was a layered process, stacking on top of itself over thousands of years. First, biology forced the discovery. Your ancestors' bodies demanded sodium, and evolution had already wired them to recognize and crave it the instant they encountered it. Then geography made the discovery possible. Natural salt deposits gave early humans direct physical access to something their bodies were already screaming for. Then ingenuity turned discovery into production. Sites like Provadia-Solnitsata show humans didn't just wait around for salt to appear. They built ovens, boiled brine, and manufactured it deliberately, thousands of years before recorded history began. And finally, scarcity turned production into power. Once salt could be made in one place and desperately needed in another, it stopped being just a nutrient. It became leverage, currency, and eventually empire-building infrastructure. Every one of those 4 stages left a trace you can still see today, the word salary sitting quietly in your vocabulary. Salt preserved foods that exist purely because ancient humans needed a way to keep meat edible without refrigeration. Entire cities that grew directly out of salt-producing operations thousands of years old. You don't think about any of this when you shake a little salt over your dinner tonight, and that's actually the most telling part of the whole story. Something so essential that entire wars were fought over it, so valuable that it once paid soldiers' wages, so central to civilization that it built ancient walled towns, has become so abundant and so cheap in your world that you barely register it as a substance worth noticing at all. That's not because salt became less important to your body. Your cells still need it exactly as much as your ancestors' cells did, thousands of generations ago. It's because humans eventually solved the scarcity that once made it precious, industrializing extraction to the point where a mineral once traded for gold now costs less than almost anything else in your kitchen. You reach for the salt shaker without thinking, and that's exactly the point. Somewhere underneath that small, unremarkable gesture is one of the oldest, longest-running stories in human history, a craving your body never stopped having, and a substance your ancestors once built walls, dug wells, and crossed deserts just to get their hands on.